She was promised to a powerful tycoon she had never met, yet the man waiting for her at the altar was not who she expected. In the glittering world of New York's Gilded Age, where fortunes rise and hearts are traded like currency, one woman will be forced to choose between duty and desire, between the name that binds her and the truth that could set her free. What begins as an arranged marriage soon becomes a battle between pride, redemption, and a love neither of them dared to believe in. Tell me, from where are you listening tonight? And do you still believe that love can be born from the ashes of betrayal? New York City, 1887. The sky above Fifth Avenue shimmered in pale winter light, gilding the rooftops of the brownstone mansions where fortune and ruin often lived side by side. Behind lace-curtained windows, whispers traveled faster than the wind. By afternoon, the name Kingsley, once uttered with admiration, had become a scandal spoken with pity and satisfaction. In the parlor of a fading townhouse, Belle Kingsley stood motionless before a mirror whose gilt frame had lost its shine. The reflection that looked back at her seemed older than her 25 years. Her hair, a soft chestnut coiled into perfect order, framed a face pale with disbelief. Only her eyes, wide, hazel, luminous with quiet strength, betrayed the storm raging within. The velvet gown she wore still carried the scent of roses from last night's ball, yet she felt stripped of everything that had once made her proud. Her father's bank had collapsed at dawn. Investors shouted his name in the streets. Clients demanded their savings. By noon, carriages that once lined the Kingsleys' doorway had disappeared, and loyal servants began to pack their belongings. Belle's world, built upon elegance and illusion, crumbled as easily as the ash in the fireplace. Her mother, Mrs. Evelyn Kingsley, paced the parlor in a dark gown trimmed with jet beads, the picture of composure masking despair. "We will not live in disgrace," she said, her voice sharp, brittle, commanding. "There is a way to restore what has been lost. A proposal has been made." Belle's heart thudded. A proposal. Evelyn turned, her gloved hands clasped tightly. "From Mr. Alistair Dunning, a man of influence, wealth beyond measure, and reputation untouched by scandal. He wishes to make you his wife." Belle blinked as if struck by cold water. "His wife, but I have never met him." "A fortunate circumstance," her mother replied. "You need not love him, only marry him. He offers stability, and that is more valuable than affection in a world that feeds on ruin." The fire crackled, throwing trembling light on the walls. Belle tried to breathe, but each inhale carried the scent of smoke and fear. She had heard of Alistair Dunning, the powerful railroad tycoon who ruled steel and men with an iron will. He was rumored to be a widower, older than her father, reclusive and ruthless in business. The thought of standing beside such a man filled her with dread. "Mamma," she whispered, "I cannot marry a stranger for money." Evelyn's expression hardened. "Then would you rather marry poverty? Do you wish to see our name erased from every invitation, every registry, every circle that once welcomed us? You are all I have left to bargain with, Belle. Do not fail me." The words fell like stones. Belle turned toward the window, watching carriages pass in the snow. Beyond the glass, laughter drifted from the wealthy who remained untouched by scandal. For the first time, she understood how fragile her world had been, a thin shell of privilege that shattered the moment fortune turned its back. Days passed in a blur of silence and humiliation. Her father locked himself in his study, surrounded by unpaid bills and unsent letters. Her mother's friends ceased calling. Even the servants avoided her eyes. When the engagement was announced in the New York Tribune, Belle felt the weight of every whispered judgment pressing upon her shoulders. The wedding was arranged swiftly, as if haste could bury disgrace. Dresses were fitted, invitations sent. The Dunning carriage arrived punctually each afternoon, delivering contracts and gifts she did not desire. On the eve of the ceremony, Belle stood alone in her bedroom, staring at the gown laid out before her, ivory satin with pearl embroidery, a creation fit for a queen, yet destined for a prisoner. She touched the fabric with trembling fingers. How could beauty feel so heavy? That night she could not sleep. She wandered through the silent house, her steps echoing on marble floors. Passing her father's study, she paused. Through the half-open door, she saw him slumped in a chair, a glass in his hand, his once proud shoulders bent. Shame and sorrow had stolen the fire from his eyes. "Father," she whispered, "tell me I am doing right." He did not answer. Morning came with the chill of resignation. Belle dressed in silence as her maid pinned the lace veil to her hair. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, relentless, indifferent. The carriage awaited her on the street, drawn by black horses whose breath misted in the cold. The city blurred past. The glittering shop windows, the iron fences, the towering spires. When the carriage stopped before the grand church on Madison Avenue, Belle's heart pounded so fiercely she feared it might break through her chest. The bells tolled, their echo rolling through the winter air like the sound of fate itself. Her mother took her arm. "Hold your head high, my dear. Remember, grace is the armor of women like us." Inside, chandeliers glowed above rows of guests draped in fur and jewels. Belle's steps echoed against the marble aisle as every eye turned toward her. The air smelled of lilies and candle wax, sweet yet suffocating. And then she saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, his face half-shadowed by the light from the stained glass. The man who waited for her was not old, nor frail, nor grey. His gaze met hers across the aisle, steady, unreadable, and filled with something she could not name. Belle faltered for the briefest moment, her breath catching beneath the veil. Who was this stranger waiting for her at the altar? She did not know that with the next step she would cross the threshold into a destiny far more complicated than she could ever imagine. The church was cloaked in solemn grandeur. Stained glass windows caught the pale morning light and fractured it into 1,000 jeweled shards, casting patterns on the marble floor that shimmered with quiet indifference to the turmoil of human hearts. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and incense, but for Belle Kingsley it felt as though every petal in bloom pressed upon her chest. She stood at the threshold, her arm resting lightly on her mother's, the lace veil framing her vision in a blur of ivory. The silence inside was oppressive, broken only by the soft creak of pews as society's finest turned to observe the fallen heiress walking toward a marriage they all whispered about. And then she saw him. The man awaiting her at the altar was not the silver-haired Tycoon whose portrait she had studied in the engagement announcement. The man standing beneath the rose-gilt arch was tall, broad of shoulder, with hair the color of ash, and eyes that seemed forged in winter. He stood still, too still, not like a man anticipating his bride, but like one enduring a moment he wished to pass quickly. His expression was unreadable, his gaze locked on her with such intensity that Belle faltered. 1,000 thoughts crashed through her mind. Was this a proxy, a cruel joke, a mistake? Yet no one else moved. The priest cleared his throat, and Evelyn's fingers pressed more firmly into Belle's arm. "Walk," her mother whispered. One step, then another. Her heart beat wildly beneath her corseted bodice, the bodice that had been stitched for a different man. The crowd watched her every motion, every breath, some with pity, others with glee. When she reached the altar, she searched his face for a clue, a word, anything. But the stranger only inclined his head slightly, as if they were acquaintances meeting in passing, not two souls about to be bound for life. He spoke not a word until the priest began the ceremony. "Do you, Elias Dunning, take this woman?" Elias Dunning. The name fell over her like snow, cold, final. Belle's lips parted slightly, but no one noticed beneath the veil. She turned her head toward him, her heart pounding against her ribs, but his answer came without hesitation. "I do." The rest passed in a haze. The words, the vows, the rings. She spoke them like one spellbound, not fully aware of what she was doing until the final benediction echoed through the rafters. "You may kiss the bride." He did not kiss her. Instead, Elias leaned in slightly, his lips brushing the air near her cheek, his breath warm against her skin. "There was no other way," he murmured, so low only she could hear. Before she could react, gloved hands ushered her toward the exit. The congregation rose, the organ thundered, the doors opened to reveal snow still falling over the carriages lined outside. In the cold light of day, nothing made sense. The ride in the carriage was silent at first, the only sound the creak of wheels and the muffled clip of hooves on slush-covered cobblestone. Belle sat upright, her gloved hands clenched tightly in her lap. Across from her, Elias sat in a dark frock coat and grey cravat, his gaze fixed on the window, as if the city outside offered some escape neither of them truly had. She could stand the silence no longer. "You are not your father," she said, her voice calm, though her throat was tight. "Why did you marry me?" His eyes shifted to her, cool, observant, unreadable. "Because he could not." "That much is obvious," she said, struggling to keep her voice from trembling. "But why you? What possible reason would the son of a tycoon have to take his father's place at the altar?" Elias hesitated, then answered with quiet precision. "My father is ill," gravely. "The marriage contract was arranged and signed under his name, but this morning he was too weak to leave his bed. The wedding had to proceed, for legal and practical reasons." Belle blinked. "So I have married a man I was not promised to, and I had no choice in the matter." "You had as much choice as I did, Miss Kingsley," he said, not unkindly but without apology. "The arrangements were already made, the terms already sealed." She turned her face to the window. Snow clung to the corners of the glass like lace, delicate and cold. The city passed in silence, but inside her chest, a storm raged louder than any blizzard. The carriage turned off the avenue and passed through tall wrought-iron gates. Belle had glimpsed the Dunning mansion in newspaper sketches, its grand facade of grey stone and massive Corinthian columns. But no ink drawing could have prepared her for its scale. As the carriage pulled into the circular drive, she saw that the house rose like a palace, its many windows glowing with amber light, its entrance flanked by marble lions. Gas lamps flickered in the gathering dusk. The driver opened the door. Elias stepped out first, then extended a gloved hand. Belle hesitated for a fraction of a moment before placing hers in his. The contact was brief, formal, and carefully devoid of warmth. A butler opened the great doors, his uniform crisp, his expression betraying no surprise at the bride who was not the bride expected. Servants lined the hall, silent, efficient, trained not to react. Belle's steps echoed across the marble floor as she was led into a vast entrance hall, dominated by a double staircase and the cold glitter of crystal chandeliers. No flowers awaited her, no welcome, no smiles. "This way," Elias said quietly, leading her not to a ballroom or salon, but down a side corridor, through a richly panelled hallway where oil portraits watched from their golden frames. He stopped before a door and pushed it open. "This is your suite," he said. "You'll find everything you need. Dinner will be sent up if you prefer not to dine below." She stepped into the room, a space more opulent than any she had ever known. Walls of deep rose damask, a canopy bed dressed in ivory lace, a fireplace crackling softly beneath an ornate mirror, a velvet chaise, a private dressing room, and yet, for all its beauty, the room felt more like a museum than a refuge. She turned. "Will I see your father?" Elias's jaw tightened. "Perhaps, but not tonight." "He is not receiving visitors." Belle's gaze searched his. "And what are we, Elias Dunning, husband and wife, or strangers bound by paper and duty?" A long pause. "We are what circumstance made us," he said, "and circumstance, Miss Kingsley, is rarely generous." With that he bowed, turned, and left her standing alone. As the door clicked shut behind him, Belle released the breath she had been holding. Her veil still rested on her head, and her wedding gown now felt like a costume worn in the wrong play. She walked to the window and pushed back the velvet drapes. Outside, snow fell steadily onto the courtyard below, where lamplight shimmered on white stone. Somewhere beyond, a world still moved, still breathed, still hoped, but inside the grand house of Dunning, all was quiet. And Belle, now Belle Dunning in name, felt the chill of marble under her skin, and the weight of a future not chosen, but sealed. Snow continued to fall over New York, coating the stone lions at the Dunning gates in a glistening layer of white. Inside the mansion, the world was all silence and shadow. Days passed with a sort of ceremonial quiet, as if the house itself had been trained to speak only in hushed tones. Belle Dunning, or so she was now called, though the name still felt foreign in her mouth, moved through the corridors like a guest too polite to ask how long she was expected to stay. No one dared call her Mrs. Dunning aloud, not even the maids who curtsied with stiff backs and averted eyes. They whispered when she passed, as if her presence were an inconvenience they had been warned not to acknowledge too loudly. The house was enormous, an edifice of wealth built to impress, and yet it felt curiously devoid of warmth. Mahogany-panelled walls rose high above her head, adorned with oil paintings of long-dead ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her movements. Velvet drapes of deep burgundy remained half-drawn, allowing only slivers of winter light to spill across parquet floors, polished to a mirrored sheen. Fireplaces crackled, but the warmth they offered could not reach the chilled spaces between rooms. Elias had vanished into routine. Each morning he disappeared behind closed doors, either tending to business affairs or retreating into the upper wings where no servant ventured without invitation. They passed one another at a distance, like actors cast in different plays. No meal was shared, no word was exchanged, and yet his presence lingered everywhere. Belle found herself drawn to the west wing of the house, an older section of the mansion where the air was heavier and the carpets more faded. One afternoon, following a trail of curiosity, she wandered deeper than she had dared before. At the end of a long hallway, she found a door half ajar. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight, filtering through a lace-curtained window. It was a music room. She recognized the shape of a grand piano beneath its cover, the stillness of forgotten melodies hanging in the air. Her fingers reached for the edge of a draped canvas on the wall. With a hesitant tug, she revealed a portrait of a young woman. The subject was striking, raven-haired, with luminous dark eyes and a slight enigmatic smile. Her dress was of midnight blue velvet, her neck adorned with pearls. There was something timeless in her posture, as though she had been painted not merely to be remembered, but to be mourned. Belle stepped closer, the name forming on her lips before she even knew why. Isabel! Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She turned sharply, but no one stood there. The following day, while crossing the servants' corridor, Belle overheard two maids whispering as they dusted silver trays. She was always too proud. Thought she could change him. Poor Isabel. But it wasn't her fault what happened. Belle paused out of sight. Still, one of them added, if I were the new one, I'd steer clear of the west wing. Ghosts don't like to be forgotten. The women scattered when they saw Belle pass, but the name echoed through her mind long after, Isabel. That evening Belle attended a supper hosted in her name. A gesture from Elias, she was told, though he did not attend. Instead, she found herself seated beside widows with sharp opinions and married women with two perfect smiles. Their husbands spoke of railroads and tariffs, while their wives dissected the latest scandal involving a young widow who had dared to dine unchaperoned. She must think marrying into a name is enough, whispered one guest behind a fan. She's very pretty, replied another with a sip of wine. But beauty fades faster than lineage. Belle sat still, chin high, hands steady. She had grown up among these women, knew the coded language of their compliments, the razor hidden behind each lace glove. Now she was the target of their amusement, the girl who had married a tycoon's son by accident or ambition, no one was quite sure. That night, Belle stood at the top of the grand staircase and looked down at the black and white marble tiles below. Each step felt like a test. Her feet moved slowly, deliberately, as if descending not into a hallway, but into a question she no longer knew how to ask. Thunder cracked outside. The storm rolled in suddenly, violent and uninvited. Wind howled against the windows. The lamps flickered. She found herself wandering again, guided by the tremor of something unnamed. A door creaked open near the library. Candlelight flickered within. Elias. He stood at the hearth, one hand braced on the mantel, the other holding a glass of untouched brandy. His coat was unbuttoned, his waistcoat slightly askew. The fire cast shadows along his jawline, accentuating the tension in his stance. Belle hesitated, then stepped inside. He did not turn. "You shouldn't be here." "Why?" she asked softly. "Is this one of the rooms I'm meant to avoid?" He faced her then. His eyes, grey as storm clouds, met hers without flinching. "This house is full of places meant to be forgotten." She took a breath. Was Isabel one of them? A silence fell between them, heavy as snowfall. His jaw tightened. "You've been listening to servants." "I've been listening to silence," she replied. "And in silence even whispers grow loud." He set the glass down with a deliberate movement. "Isabel is dead." "I gathered that," Belle said. "But no one dies without leaving something behind. A name, a painting, a warning." Elias walked toward her slowly, his footsteps echoing off the stone. "You are not her," he said, voice low. "Don't try to be." "I wasn't," she replied, refusing to step back. "But I won't pretend I didn't see the way your eyes looked at me when I arrived. Like I'd stepped into a place I didn't belong, or worse, replaced someone you lost." He stopped only a breath away. The space between them was charged, like the air before lightning strikes. "You ask too many questions," he said. "And you answer none." "Because answers carry weight," he murmured, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "And not all of us survive the burden." Belle's throat tightened. "Then I'd rather be crushed by truth than suffocated by doubt." For a moment, nothing moved. The wind rattled the windows. The fire hissed. Elias's gaze dropped to her mouth, then quickly returned to her eyes, as though he had caught himself indulging in a thought he wasn't ready to have. He stepped back. "Go to your room, Belle," he said, "and stay away from things you do not understand." The door closed behind her with a quiet finality. She returned to her suite, but sleep would not come. Instead, she sat by the window, watching the storm rage outside, her fingers curled around the armrest of her chair. The house was full of ghosts, some painted, some buried, some still walking, and she, it seemed, had become one of them. The snow had melted into a cold, silvery mist that hung low over New York City, blurring the line between earth and sky. Inside the Dunning mansion, the world existed in muted tones, grey, ivory, and shadow. Each room seemed suspended in time, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Belle awoke to the soft chime of the morning clock. Her maid entered quietly, setting down a silver tray with tea and letters. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish and winter air. For a long moment, Belle remained seated at the edge of the bed, her gaze drifting to the frost tracing delicate patterns across the window pane. Each morning since the storm had passed, she had risen with a single, unspoken question in her heart, one that had no answer. Who was Isabel? Elias avoided her still. Their encounters had dwindled to polite greetings in the corridor or brief exchanges at the threshold of her door. He carried himself with composure, always composed, always distant. Yet sometimes, when he passed too close, Belle felt something wordless and unfinished hovering between them, a silence that was heavier than words. That morning, curiosity drew her once again toward the west wing. The air there was cooler, untouched. She followed the corridor until she reached the music room, the place where she had found Isabel's portrait days before. The piano remained covered in dust, its keys hidden beneath a yellowing cloth. But this time something new caught her attention. A faint outline on the wall beside the fireplace, where another frame had once hung. She stepped closer. The shape of the outline was tall and rectangular. When she reached to touch the wall, her fingers found a hidden latch disguised beneath a carved molding. The panel gave way with a soft creak, revealing a narrow recess. Inside hung another painting, smaller, more intimate. It was a portrait of Elias, younger, perhaps by several years. He wore a dark frock coat, the faintest trace of a smile curving his lips. Yet what struck her most was the scar that marred his otherwise perfect jawline, a pale diagonal mark that even the artist had not softened. His eyes in the portrait were alive, brighter than the ones she knew now. Belle stepped back, her pulse quickening. Who had painted it, and why was it hidden? She reached up to brush the dust from the frame, her fingers trembling slightly. Beneath the corner of the painting, tucked behind the canvas, she felt paper, a letter folded once, sealed with wax. She hesitated only a moment before breaking the seal. The handwriting was delicate, unmistakably feminine. My dearest Elias, you once said, "The heart forgets what pride remembers." I am beginning to believe you were right. I have no wish for your forgiveness, only for your peace. If by the time you read this, I am gone, know that it was not you who failed me, but the world that demanded too much from both of us. Isabel. The words blurred before Belle's eyes. Her hand trembled. She refolded the letter and slipped it back where she had found it, the air around her thick with questions she dared not voice aloud. Later that day, while descending the grand staircase, she heard the butler announce a visitor. Mr. Charles Merton, to see Mrs. Dunning. For a heartbeat, the name meant nothing. Then, like a chord struck in her memory, recognition flooded her. Charles, her father's associate, the man who had once courted her with poetry and flowers before everything had fallen apart. Belle descended the stairs slowly. Charles stood in the foyer, his hat in hand, his expression grave. He looked older, wearier, but the same earnest warmth flickered in his eyes when he saw her. "Belle," he said softly, "I wasn't sure you'd receive me." "I shouldn't," she replied, glancing at the servants, "but I will." They retreated to the small drawing room off the hall. The fire was already lit, the curtains drawn. Charles stood near the hearth, rubbing his gloved hands together, while Belle remained by the window, her profile outlined against the pale afternoon light. "I heard what happened to your father," he began, "and about your marriage." Her voice was calm. "You came to offer your condolences or your curiosity?" "Neither," he said, his tone dropping. "I came to warn you." She turned. "About what?" Charles hesitated, then stepped closer. "The Dunnings. You know their fortune was built on steel and rails, but not all of it was earned honestly. Your father's bank was involved in a transaction last year, a merger that collapsed under mysterious circumstances. I've seen the ledgers myself. The elder Dunning withdrew funds the night before the crash. Your father was left to take the blame." Belle's breath caught. "You're saying it was deliberate?" "I'm saying," he replied carefully, "that your father's ruin may have been orchestrated by Alistair Dunning himself." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Belle's mind reeled. It couldn't be true, yet it explained so much: the suddenness of the collapse, the silence that followed, the haste with which her mother had arranged the marriage. "Why tell me this now?" she asked. "Because I saw your name in the papers," Charles said, "because I still care what happens to you, and because whatever hold that family has on your mother, you deserve to know the truth." He placed a folded document on the table, records of transactions, she assumed, then bowed slightly. "Be careful, Belle. You're living among people who destroy what they can't control." And with that, he was gone. For a long while she remained still, the letter's weight pressing against her heart. Outside, sleigh bells jingled faintly along the avenue, their sound swallowed by the city's winter hush. When she finally moved, it was toward the study. Elias was there, she knew. He spent every evening in that room, reading reports by lamplight, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. She found him seated at his desk, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his expression weary. The lamplight drew warm tones from his hair and highlighted the sharp angles of his face. "I had a visitor today," she said. He did not look up. "So I was told." "Charles Merton." That name made him pause. His pen stopped mid-stroke. "What did he want?" "He came to tell me things about my father's ruin," Belle said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "About your father's involvement." Elias leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You shouldn't listen to gossip." "This wasn't gossip," she replied. "He showed me evidence." Something flickered in his eyes, anger perhaps, or fear, but it vanished quickly behind his composure. "Mr. Merton has reason to resent my family. His business interests were, let's say, less honorable than he'd have you believe. So you deny it." "I deny nothing," he said, his tone cold now, "but neither will I defend what doesn't concern you." Her heart clenched. "Doesn't concern me. My father lost everything. My family was shamed. And I was married into yours to, what, seal a convenient arrangement." His voice was quiet but sharp. "You think I wanted this marriage?" "I don't know what you want, Elias," she said. "You speak in riddles and hide behind silence. I find letters hidden in walls, portraits of women whose names are whispered like prayers, and still you pretend there's nothing to explain." He stood then, abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. "Isabel's name does not belong on your lips." The suddenness of his anger made her flinch, but she held her ground. "Then tell me why she haunts this house." He exhaled slowly, his shoulders tense. "Because she was a reminder of what happens when pride and obedience collide. That is all you need to know." Belle's voice softened, almost pleading. "And you? What are you, Elias Dunning? A man bound by obedience or haunted by pride?" For a moment he said nothing. The firelight cast his shadow long against the wall, and she saw the faint glimmer of the scar along his jaw, the same one in the hidden portrait. He reached up absently, touching it as if it burned. "Both," he said finally, and his voice carried something fragile beneath its firmness, "and neither one has ever brought me peace." Then he turned away, returning to his desk, his face hidden once more by lamplight. Belle left the study quietly, her heart torn between pity and anger, suspicion and something far more dangerous, something that deepened each time she saw the man behind the mask falter, even for a heartbeat. Upstairs, in the solitude of her room, she unwrapped the folded papers Charles had left. Figures, signatures, dates, all leading to the same name, Alistair Dunning. The truth, she realized, was a tapestry woven from lies and loyalty, and she was caught at its center, unsure which thread to pull without unraveling everything. She closed her eyes, the sound of Elias's voice still echoing in her memory. "Both," he had said. Pride, obedience. And in the silence of the great house, Belle began to understand that sometimes the most dangerous ghosts were not the ones painted on the walls, but the ones that still breathed. The chandeliers of the Dunning ballroom cast pools of golden light over the polished floor, their crystal prisms catching every flicker of flame and scattering it like fallen stars. Outside, the December night had surrendered to frost, but inside the mansion, warmth and wealth clung to every silk-covered chair, every gilt-framed portrait, every murmured toast. It was the first formal dinner Belle had attended since her wedding, and the first time she had stood so visibly beneath the scrutinizing gaze of New York's elite as the new mistress of the Dunning house. She wore a gown of deep sapphire satin, the bodice embroidered with tiny seed pearls, its neckline modest yet elegant. Her chestnut hair had been swept into a graceful chignon, secured with silver combs. She looked the part, and she moved with quiet dignity. Yet beneath the surface, her nerves trembled like the flame of a candle in a draught. The room was filled with powerful men, railroad investors, bankers and steel tycoons, surrounded by wives in diamonds and furs, their voices like wind chimes stirred by rivalry. Belle's presence among them was not yet accepted. Whispers trailed her, a ruined banker's daughter, married into fortune overnight. Surely not by affection. At the head of the long table sat Elias, poised and unreadable as ever, his grey eyes shadowed by the weight of a legacy not entirely his own. He wore a black dinner coat and a waistcoat of smoke-grey brocade, a silver watch chain glinting against his chest. He had barely acknowledged Belle all evening, aside from the courteous gesture of offering his arm to escort her into the dining hall. And yet, she felt his attention like the brush of a hand at her back, subtle, constant, impossible to ignore. As the meal progressed, the conversation turned toward politics and progress. The expansion of the Western railways, steel tariffs, labour strikes. A toast was made to the Dunning family, to the empire built by Alistair and carried forward by Elias. The men raised their glasses. Belle remained silent, her fingers curled lightly around her crystal stem. It was then that one of the guests, a portly man with red cheeks and a voice too loud for his own good, glanced in Belle's direction and smiled with thinly veiled amusement. "Tell me, Mrs. Dunning," he said, "do you find it difficult adjusting to such elevated company? I imagine Fifth Avenue requires a different sort of polish than Wall Street." A ripple of laughter followed, not loud but pointed. Belle felt the blood rise to her cheeks. Her spine straightened. She met the man's gaze without flinching. "Polish is useful," she replied, her voice even, "but it's not what keeps the engines running." More laughter, this time sharper. The man raised his brows, amused. "Indeed. I dare say you found your footing quickly." Before Belle could respond, Elias set down his fork with a quiet, deliberate clink. The room stilled. "My wife's background," he said calmly, "is one of integrity, resilience, and loyalty. These qualities, I believe, are of far more value than inherited fortune, and certainly more than wine-fueled mockery." A heavy silence followed. The man's smile faded. A few guests looked away. One woman dropped her gaze entirely, flustered. Belle remained frozen, not from embarrassment, but from the shock of being defended, publicly, firmly. Elias lifted his glass slightly, his gaze not on the guest, but on her. "To Mrs. Dunning," he said, "may we all rise to her standard." And the toast was awkward, mumbled by some, avoided by others, but the statement had been made, and the room, for the rest of the night, kept its whispers to itself. Later, when the guests had departed and the servants had begun clearing the remnants of the evening, Belle remained seated by the fireplace in the drawing-room, her gloves still in her lap, her pulse still unsteady. Elias entered quietly. He poured himself a drink from the sideboard but didn't sit. For a moment, there was only the crackle of the fire between them. "You didn't have to say anything," she said softly. "I didn't do it for you," he replied, then paused. "Not entirely." She turned to look at him, her expression calm. "Then, for whom?" He sipped his drink. "For the truth, and for the quiet." "The quiet?" He leaned against the mantel, his gaze distant. "I tire of hearing your name mangled by people who have never had to earn anything. They wear their bloodlines like armor and confuse cruelty with power." Belle studied him, noting the fatigue behind his eyes, the stiffness in his posture. Something inside her shifted, not in pity, but in understanding. "You said once you didn't want this marriage," she said. His eyes met hers, unwavering. "I didn't." That admission should have stung. But Belle only nodded. "Neither did I." A silence stretched between them, long but not empty. He looked down at his glass, then back at her. "But I couldn't let my father take you," she blinked. "Take me?" "He would have used you, parade you around as proof that the Kingsleys were ours to tame. He enjoys power that humiliates. I thought, if I stood in his place, it would spare you something of that." Belle stood slowly, her gloves falling to the floor unnoticed. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You married me to protect me." Elias set the glass down. "I married you because it was the only way I could stop him. I thought perhaps I could give you peace, or at least time." A fire burned low behind him. Its light flickered across his face, softening the harsh angles, casting golden warmth where there had only ever been coldness. Belle stepped closer. "And what of your peace, Elias?" He looked at her then, truly looked, and in his eyes she saw a storm, regret, anger, loneliness, and something else, something that dared not name itself. "I stopped believing in peace a long time ago," he murmured. Belle's breath caught. Their hands were close, almost touching on the carved edge of the mantle. The space between their fingers narrowed until his knuckles brushed hers, just barely. A touch so faint it could have been a mistake, but neither of them moved. "I don't know what this marriage is meant to become," she said. "Neither do I." They stood there, firelight flickering, unspoken emotions rising like heat between them. Later that night, Belle stepped into the garden alone. The air was crisp, the stone path glistening with frost. Gas lamps lined the walkway, casting soft halos of amber light that swayed gently in the breeze. She wasn't surprised when she heard his steps behind her. Elias joined her in silence. For a while, they walked without speaking, their footsteps in rhythm. Not lovers, not friends, yet no longer strangers. Under one of the iron arches strung with winter roses, she paused. He did too. Their breaths formed little clouds in the cold. She looked up at him, her voice quiet. "What do you see when you look at me, Elias?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was with care. "I see someone braver than I expected, stronger than I deserve." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She simply nodded. "Then perhaps we can find something real in this, even if it wasn't what either of us asked for." He didn't speak, but his hand moved, slowly, so slowly, and brushed the back of hers again. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise, but it was a beginning. And under the soft glow of the gaslight, with frost on the roses and silence between them, Belle felt something stir inside her chest, fragile, aching, and utterly alive. The snow had returned, blanketing the streets of New York with a deceptive softness that quieted the noise of the city, but did little to soothe its unrest. From the tall windows of the Dunning mansion, Belle watched as white flakes drifted slowly past the gas lamps, melting against the glass with the delicate finality of a sigh. The world outside was cold, still, silent, so unlike the storm gathering within her. The evening had begun in routine silence. Elias had retired to his study early, as he often did, and Belle had remained in her chambers, reading without truly seeing the words on the page. Her thoughts wandered restlessly to the conversation they had shared in the garden just nights before, words soft as breath, touches fleeting as snowflakes, glances that hinted at something unspoken. She had dared to hope, but hope in houses like this was a fragile thing, and something beneath the surface still didn't sit right in her soul. After the lamps were dimmed and the halls hushed with slumber, Belle left her room. She moved like a shadow through the corridors, the hem of her dressing gown brushing against the polished floors. She wasn't sure what had drawn her there, only that the silence felt too heavy to ignore and the unanswered questions had grown too loud to silence. The door to Elias's study creaked open at her touch. Inside, the room smelled of tobacco, paper, and leather-bound silence. The fireplace had burned down to soft embers, casting an amber glow across the shelves and dark wood paneling. His desk stood in the center, a fortress of ledgers, ink bottles, and unopened correspondence. She hesitated. It was not in her nature to invade another's privacy, but something, perhaps instinct, perhaps warning, urged her forward. She stepped behind the desk, her fingers grazing the smooth surface. The drawers were locked, but one gave under slight pressure. Inside were contracts, ledgers, receipts, all meticulously arranged. It was the drawer beneath that caught her breath. A stack of yellowed envelopes, tied with a black ribbon. She untied them slowly, reverently, as if they might vanish in her hands. The first letter was addressed not to Elias, but to Alistair Dunning. Her eyes moved swiftly across the page. The language was cold, calculated. It spoke of stock manipulation, of timed withdrawals, of orchestrated failure. Names were listed, bankers, brokers, and finally near the bottom, a signature she knew too well. James Kingsley, her father. She read another, and another. The truth crystallized with every word. The Dunning patriarch had not simply watched her family fall, he had orchestrated it, crushed her father beneath the wheels of revenge and profit. Her father's ruin had been intentional, strategic, and Elias had known. One letter, dated just weeks before their wedding, was written in Elias's hand. It was addressed to his father and pleaded for restraint, warning of the consequences of further humiliation. But there was no condemnation, no ultimatum, no action. Belle's hands trembled. The papers fell from her fingers like leaves in the wind. The door opened behind her. She turned. Elias stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark with a tension she could no longer mistake for calm. "You knew," she said, her voice low and wounded. He stepped inside, his gaze falling to the letters at her feet. "Belle, how long?" she asked. "How long have you known what your father did to mine?" His silence answered her. She took a breath, but it did not steady her. "You married me to shield me from scandal, to keep me from being a pawn. But you knew I already was one. You stood beside me, night after night, knowing your family destroyed mine." Elias moved toward her slowly, his voice strained. "It wasn't my choice." "But it was your silence," she interrupted, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You stood at the altar with full knowledge of the truth. You touched my hand, knowing it had been forced into yours by blood spilled behind closed doors. And still, you said nothing." "I tried to stop him," Elias said, his voice breaking under the weight of a truth he had never wanted to speak aloud. "I begged him to end it. I warned him." "You warned him," she echoed bitterly. "Not me." Elias stepped closer. "What would you have had me do?" "Tell me," she cried. "Tell me before I stood in that church. Tell me before I opened my heart to the idea that we could be more than a contract signed in ashes. You robbed me of truth, Elias. That is worse than betrayal. That is erasure." Her voice trembled now, but she refused to look away. He reached for her, but she stepped back. "You married me out of guilt," she whispered. "Not love." His hand dropped. "You're right," he said. "I did." The silence that followed was more painful than any scream. Belle turned from him. The letters remained scattered across the floor like broken glass. "I cannot stay here," she said. "Not in this house, not under his roof, not beside a man who let me drown in lies because silence was easier than truth." Elias's shoulders fell, his breath unsteady. "Where will you go? Where there are no portraits watching, no contracts waiting, no names to protect?" He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, she saw the defeat he could no longer hide. "I'll have the carriage brought around." She didn't thank him. She couldn't. By the time dawn broke over the rooftops of Fifth Avenue, Belle was gone. The doors of the Dunning mansion closed behind her with the cold finality of a vault. Inside the carriage, she sat with her gloved hands clenched in her lap, her face turned to the window, her heart aching in a way that no scandal or ruin had ever made it ache before. She had married a stranger, and now she had left behind the only man who for one fleeting moment had dared to make her believe she wasn't. The city passed in silence. Her mother's house loomed ahead, an old refuge, now a retreat. Belle stepped out of the carriage without waiting for assistance. She did not look back, and inside the mansion she had fled, Elias remained alone in the study, the fire dying slowly beside him, and the letters still scattered like the wreckage of a war neither of them had won. The drawing room in Evelyn Kingsley's townhome smelled of camphor, stale flowers, and quiet disappointment. Though Belle had returned to the house where she'd once been admired as the most promising debutante of her season, it no longer felt like a home. The furniture remained as she remembered, velvet armchairs, gilded frames, and porcelain vases from Paris. But the warmth had long since vanished, replaced by the cold echoes of disgrace. A week had passed since Belle had fled the Dunning mansion. In that time, her absence had not remained private. Society, always ravenous for scandal, had feasted on her departure with gleeful fervour. Mrs. Dunning returns to mother's house, alone. Whispers of annulment shake Fifth Avenue. Was it all for the dowry? The headlines varied in cruelty, but they agreed on one thing: Belle had failed. She had been chosen by one of the city's most powerful families, and yet she had walked away. She sat near the window, her gloved hands folded in her lap, staring out at the street where carriages passed without pause. Once she had waved from that window to suitors below. Now the curtains remained drawn most days. Her mother insisted on it. Evelyn entered the room with the deliberate steps of a woman who had practiced grace long after the world stopped offering her kindness. Her morning gown was adorned with discreet jet beads, her silver hair arranged in perfect coils beneath a netted cap. She carried a folded newspaper and a look of restrained fury. "More column inches," she said coolly. "You would think the press might grow weary, but no. Your shame feeds them like clockwork." Belle did not turn. "I did what I had to do." "You did what you felt," Evelyn corrected. "And now you expect the world to understand feelings." She walked to the settee across from her daughter and sat with elegance sharpened by decades of survival. "You had everything a woman could ask for, and still you ran." Belle looked at her mother then, eyes dark with sorrow. "He lied to me. He kept from me the very thing that destroyed Father's life." "Which you might have forgiven," Evelyn said, "if you hadn't gone looking for it in the first place." Silence settled between them. "I am not angry that you left him," her mother continued after a moment. "I am angry that you did it publicly, without strategy, without dignity. Do you know how many doors have closed to us since your return?" "I didn't come back to be received," Belle said, rising slowly. "I came back because I could not live another day beneath a roof built on ruin." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you are a woman of principle. And like all women of principle, you will learn what it means to be alone." She stood and left the room without another word. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again. Belle walked to the window and pressed her fingers lightly against the cold glass. She wondered what Elias was doing at that very moment, whether he read the papers, whether he regretted not stopping her, whether he ever truly believed in her at all. She had locked her door to him since the day she arrived. She had returned his letters unread and refused his carriage when it came each morning. Pride held her fast, but something inside her, something soft and aching, longed to hear the sound of his voice. In the Dunning mansion, Elias sat alone in the library. The fire burned low. Letters lay unopened on his desk. He had barely spoken to his father since Belle's departure. Not because there was nothing to say, but because words between them had long become currency, not connection. Alistair had summoned him that morning. The meeting had taken place in the cold drawing room where every surface gleamed with wealth and none with warmth. "You're an embarrassment," Alistair had said, his voice cutting. "You let her walk out, and you let the press devour us." Elias had not flinched. "You devoured her father. I only allowed her to leave what was never truly hers to keep." Alistair had slammed a document onto the table. "This merger is the future. You will sign it." "No," Elias said quietly. "It benefits no one but us. It will collapse small lines and destroy families. I won't do it." His father's face turned a shade redder. "You are not here to weigh justice. You are here to expand what I built. I'm not here to carry your sins." That had been the end. Alistair stood, eyes cold as steel. "Then get out of my house, out of my name. The fortune stops with me." Elias had said nothing. Pride kept his shoulders straight, though a quiet devastation bloomed in his chest. He left the room without looking back. That night, he returned to the study. The room still held Belle's scent, faint lilac and linen. Her gloves, left behind, rested on the edge of the desk. He picked them up, holding them in his hand as though they might still carry the warmth of her touch. He had failed her, not only by remaining silent, but by allowing fear to shape their beginning. In her mother's house, Belle sat by the fire, rereading the last note Elias had sent, a single line written in precise script. "If truth was the price of your love, I should have spoken sooner." She closed her eyes. His words rang hollow, yet sincere, wounded, yet humble. She ached from the weight of it all. The next morning, Evelyn stood in the parlour, speaking with a messenger. Belle remained in the hallway, unseen. "He's been disowned," the messenger said. "It's in today's paper. Alistair Dunning has cut ties with his son, refused the merger, and the boys resigned from the board." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. What does he gain from that? Nothing, except perhaps a conscience. Belle's breath caught. She stepped back from the doorway, her heart thudding. She felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet. The city roared outside, cabs, bells, footsteps, but in her chest, only silence. He had chosen ruin over comfort, integrity over legacy. She pressed her hand to the pendant around her neck, the one Elias had given her on their wedding night, cold now against her skin, but no longer meaningless. She was still angry, still hurt, but something deep within her stirred, an ember, perhaps, not yet extinguished. That night, as the snow fell once more over the rooftops of Manhattan, Belle stood at the window and watched the lights flicker in the distance. Somewhere, beyond the mist and the gas lamps, Elias Dunning walked alone through the empire his father had built, and he was beginning, at last, to tear it down. Not for redemption, not for glory, but, she now knew, for her. The wind whipped mercilessly along Fifth Avenue, bending the trees outside Evelyn Kingsley's townhouse and rattling the shutters like an omen. Inside, Belle stood beside the fireplace, the letter in her hand trembling ever so slightly, though not from the cold. It had arrived that morning, folded neatly, sealed in navy blue wax, and delivered by a familiar coachman whose eyes dared not meet hers. The message was brief. A single line written in the clean, controlled script she now recognized as belonging to the Dunning estate's steward. "Mr. Alistair Dunning is near death. He has asked to speak with you. By name." Belle read the sentence again, and again. Evelyn entered the room and glanced at the letter with disdain, as if the paper itself carried the scent of shame. "You're not truly considering it," she said without preamble. Belle did not look at her. "He's dying." "So let him die," her mother answered coldly. "He did not think of your father as a man when he ruined him, only as an obstacle to remove. Let him leave this world the way he lived in it, alone, feared, unloved." But Belle's heart, for all its fury and ache, could not ignore the weight of the request. Not because Alistair deserved her presence, but because Elias had once stood in that house, between her and the man who had destroyed so much. And because her conscience whispered that perhaps in the end some truths demanded to be heard face to face. By early afternoon, she sat once more in a Dunning carriage. The city blurred past, grey and wet, under a sky heavy with snow. Her hands were gloved, her expression composed, but inside something fragile stirred. The mansion loomed as she remembered it, stone and shadow, coldly magnificent. The front doors opened without a word. The butler bowed slightly, as if her presence were expected but not welcomed. She was led through silent halls, where gas lamps flickered against dark-panelled walls, casting the same distorted shadows she had once memorized in solitude. The portraits on the walls watched her pass, with their painted eyes. Dunning ancestors, proud and unsmiling, frozen in a history written by conquest and silence. At the end of a long corridor, the doors to Alistair Dunning's private chambers stood open. A nurse rose from a chair and nodded once before disappearing into an adjoining room. Belle stepped inside slowly. The curtains were drawn, though a faint grey light filtered through the edges. The air smelled of laudanum and wilted roses. Alistair lay in a high bed carved of mahogany, his once imposing frame reduced to a husk beneath layers of linen and wool. His skin was waxen, his breath shallow, and the sharp cheekbones that had once inspired respect now cast the hollow shadows of decay. His eyes, however, still held the same piercing intelligence, dulled only by pain. When he saw her, something flickered in them. Surprise, relief, triumph. "You came," he rasped. Belle nodded. "You asked for me." A bitter smile tugged at his lips. "So obedient even now. That's why I chose you." She stiffened but did not speak. He coughed, dry, weak. His hand trembled as it reached for the edge of the blanket. Belle took a step closer, though every instinct in her warned her to keep her distance. "I suppose you've come to ask why," he murmured. "Why I destroyed your father. Why I forced you into my son's life. Why I sit here now, choking on my own bones, asking for your company like a repentant fool." "I came," Belle said softly, "because I no longer wish to live in shadows." His laugh was more breath than sound. "Shadows. Yes, that's where we all dwell in the end. Even the kings." He turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing. "Your father crossed me. I warned him. He aligned with men who threatened my holdings. He believed he could outplay me." "You ruined him," she whispered. "I outmaneuvered him," Alistair replied, his voice brittle. "And I would do it again." "The world is not built on kindness, Mrs. Dunning. It is built on leverage." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. He coughed again, this time longer, his whole body trembling from the effort. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of its usual steel. "Elias never wanted any of this," he said. He fought me harder than anyone ever has. He refused to help destroy your father, threatened to leave, said he would walk away from the company, from me." Belle's breath caught. "I told him he was a fool. That sentiment was for the poor, that protecting you would be his ruin." Alistair's eyes met hers then, and for the first time she saw something beneath the cruelty. Regret, perhaps, or the beginning of it. "He married you to stop me. He thought he could shield you, thought that by binding you to him I'd have no reason to parade your disgrace." Belle sank into the chair beside the bed, her chest tight. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I am dying," he whispered, "and because the last thing I see when I close my eyes is my son's face, the day you left him." He turned his head toward the ceiling. "He never looked at me the way he looked at you, not once, not in 30 years. Belle swallowed hard. "He never told me." "Because he's my son," Alistair said, with a touch of grim pride. "And pride is the last gift I ever gave him." Silence stretched between them. Then, with a final exhale, Alistair Dunning closed his eyes. His chest rose once more, and did not fall again. The room fell still. The nurse returned and moved quietly to the bedside, closing his eyes, straightening the sheets. Belle rose, her legs trembling beneath her. The hallway outside was empty. She stood in the corridor, unable to move, when a door opened at the far end. Elias appeared, his expression unreadable, his hair slightly disheveled, as though he had not slept in days. When he saw her, he stopped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Belle took a step forward. "He told me," she said softly. Elias looked away, swallowing hard. "I didn't know if he would. He said you tried to protect me," she continued, "that you fought him." Elias's voice was low. "I failed you." "No," she said. "You silenced yourself. That is not the same." He exhaled, and in that breath she saw the pain he carried, sharp, long buried, now rising like a tide. "I hated him," he said, "and still I wept like a child when he stopped breathing." Belle stepped closer. The space between them narrowed until only a breath remained. "I saw your father die," she said, "but for the first time, I saw you." Elias met her eyes. "And what did you see?" She hesitated. Then quietly, "A man, not a name." And for the first time, he did not look away. The gas lamps flickered against the windows of the Dunning townhouse as twilight descended over Manhattan, Shadows stretched long over the polished floors, and the scent of rain still clung to the air from the late afternoon storm. Belle stood in the vestibule, her gloves clutched tightly in one hand, unsure if the silence of the house was an invitation or a warning. Elias had not met her at the carriage. He hadn't sent a note nor word through the staff. And yet, here she was. She had returned not for him, not for forgiveness or comfort, but because something in his eyes at his father's deathbed had unsettled her. Something true, something broken. Mrs. Avery, the housekeeper, appeared at the top of the staircase, surprised but too polite to show it. "Mrs. Dunning," she said with a soft bow, her voice nearly swallowed by the hush of the hall. "I will wait in the library," Belle replied, her voice even, though her pulse beat like wings against her throat. She crossed the marble floor slowly, her steps echoing off the high ceilings. When she reached the threshold of the library, the place where Elias had once warned her to stay out, she paused. The room was dim, lit only by a few low sconces and the amber coals of the fire. Elias sat in the leather armchair near the hearth, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a glass untouched beside him, and an unopened letter resting on his lap. He didn't rise when she entered. He didn't speak. Belle stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I didn't come for an apology," she said. His eyes lifted to hers. They were dark, tired, but clear, and for the first time in many weeks, they held no anger, only sorrow. "I wouldn't insult you with one," Elias murmured, "but I'm glad you're here." She moved toward the window where the rain had streaked the glass. The city beyond looked blurred and unreal. "Your father's words before he died, they changed something," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Not because he was kind, he wasn't, but because I saw you." He stood slowly. "I've always been afraid you'd see me." Belle turned to face him. "Why?" He laughed, bitter and soft. "Because when I first saw you, it was years ago. You were walking out of the Winter Garden Theatre with your mother. You had a ribbon in your hair, blue. You smiled at the driver who nearly ran over your foot and then scolded him for not watching the street." She blinked, stunned. "I admired you before I ever knew your name," he continued, stepping closer, his voice gaining strength. "And when my father announced he'd found a way to bind the Kingsleys to us, I fought him. I told him I wouldn't be his pawn. He told me I could either take your hand or let him destroy what was left of your life. So I chose what I could live with. And I hated myself for it." Belle's chest rose and fell with the weight of his confession. She turned from the window and approached him slowly, not touching, but close enough to feel his warmth. "I hated you too," she whispered, "but never fully, even when I wanted to." His shoulders dropped, as if the armor he wore had finally cracked. "I kept Isabel's portrait because I thought I had failed her. She died in that house, alone, because I was too much a coward to leave my father's empire behind. When you arrived, I thought I was being punished." Belle's gaze softened. "You weren't." Silence stretched between them, not cold this time, but dense with things unspoken. And then, gently, she reached for his hand. Their fingers touched, hesitant at first, and then curled together, firm. It was not forgiveness in words, it was something deeper. Later that evening, Belle sat at the desk in the upstairs study, the one she had once found locked. A clean sheet of cream-colored paper lay before her, and a gold fountain pen trembled between her fingers. She had hesitated for days, knowing what this letter would mean. But after the quiet understanding forged in the library, after Elias had stood beside her not as a prisoner of guilt, but as a man willing to change, she knew it was time. Her hand moved across the paper, firm and clear. To the editor of the New York Sentinel. She told the truth, not for revenge but for liberation, of how her father's ruin had not been the result of reckless investments or moral failings, but of calculated sabotage, of how certain rail interests, under Alistair Dunning's leadership, had crushed smaller banks to consolidate power. She did not name Elias. She did not speak of marriage or betrayal, only of justice. Of families displaced, of reputations shattered, of a world that needed to stop protecting the powerful at the expense of the honest. She signed it plainly, Belle Kingsley Dunning. 2 days later, the story ran on the front page. The city stirred. Whispers followed her when she walked the streets, but this time not out of scorn. Women in glove shops glanced at her with new respect. Gentlemen at clubs discussed the letter's impact. And one morning, as she stood outside St. Bartholomew's with Elias at her side, a woman her mother once called unapproachable leaned in and whispered, "You were very brave." Belle said nothing. She only smiled faintly and walked on. At home, she and Elias met with their attorneys. They made quiet arrangements to sell off several of the Dunning family holdings, properties acquired through underhanded deals. Factories would be turned over to independent management, shares transferred. It was not ruin, but it was relinquishment. A dismantling of legacy in favor of conscience. In the Rose Garden, where once Belle had walked alone, they now walked together, arm in arm. She no longer flinched at his touch. He no longer spoke in riddles or silence. One afternoon, Elias paused beneath a blooming arch of white climbing roses. "I never earned your love," he said. Belle looked up at him, the sunlight turning her auburn hair to fire. "Love isn't earned. It's given, but it must be safe to give." He bowed his head. "I want to be that." She touched his cheek. "Then be it." They stood there as the light faded around them, two souls no longer hiding behind duty or guilt. The gaslight from the drawing room flickered on behind the windows, casting long shadows on the gravel path, but neither of them moved. Later that night, Belle opened the drawer of her vanity and took out Isabel's letter once more. She read it slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. The words were blurred with time, but clear enough. "He is not cruel, only wounded. Don't let his silence build walls between you." Belle folded the letter carefully, placed it back into its envelope and whispered, "Thank you." Then she blew out the candle and returned to the man who waited quietly in the next room. They were no longer bound by obligation, deception, or fear. They had chosen each other, and that choice, forged in gaslight and silence, held more weight than any vow ever spoken. The scent of lilacs drifted through the open windows of the Dunning countryside estate, sweetened by the gentle warmth of early summer. Nestled between rolling hills and meadows, freshly awakened by spring's retreat, the house stood not as a monument to power, but as a quiet sanctuary repurposed for peace. 1 year had passed since Belle had walked back into Elias's world, this time by choice, not by obligation. Much had changed in those months, not only in the city's perception of her, but in the rhythm of their lives, now free from shadows of the past. That afternoon, the estate buzzed softly with preparation. Tables dressed in ivory linen were arranged under the wide oaks of the southern garden. Glass lanterns hung from branches like glowing fruit, ready to cast warm halos once the sun dipped behind the ridge. A string quartet tuned their instruments near the white gazebo, and the kitchen sent out the scent of lemon custard and cinnamon rolls. It was not a lavish affair. No society editors had been invited, no elaborate gowns or diamond tiaras paraded. Those who arrived did so with humility and genuine respect, neighbors, old friends, and even a few former skeptics from Fifth Avenue who now spoke Belle's name not with scorn, but admiration. Inside the house, Belle stood before her dressing mirror, fastening the last pearl button of her soft cream gown. Her silhouette had changed, gently, beautifully, her hands now curved instinctively to her stomach, where the small swell beneath her bodice marked the beginning of new life. A child, their child. Evelyn Kingsley, seated on the edge of a nearby chaise, dabbed at her eyes with a lace-edged handkerchief. Her mother had changed too, less rigid, less consumed with appearances. Age and humility had softened her, and today, for once, she said nothing of posture or polish, only, "You look exactly as you should, Belle." Content. Belle turned, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the delicate cameo pendant at her throat. "I never thought I would be," she confessed. Not truly. Downstairs, Elias waited by the front steps. His dark navy suit was cut sharply at the shoulders, the cuffs of his shirt precisely folded over silver cufflinks. But there was a looseness to his bearing now, an ease Belle had never seen in those early months. No longer bracing against expectations, he now walked as a man who had nothing to prove. When she stepped outside, the breeze caught the edge of her skirt, and the golden light spilled across her face. Elias inhaled sharply, as if seeing her anew. He extended his arm. "Mrs. Dunning." She took it with a smile. "Still?" "Always," he said. "Unless you'd prefer something else." She arched a brow. "Such as?" He leaned in, his voice low and close. "Belle, just Belle, the woman who undid me." They descended the steps and joined the garden, where the gathering had already begun. The music floated softly, unobtrusively through the trees. Fireflies danced along the hedgerows, and children chased them, giggling. At a long table near the hedgerow, Mrs. Avery sat with two of the maids who now ran the estate's domestic affairs. They whispered approvingly when Belle passed. Nearby, Charles Merton, now a family friend more than a former suitor, lifted his glass in silent salute. Everywhere Belle turned, the judgment she once feared had been replaced with something else. Not adoration, not blind praise, but quiet recognition, as if the woman once mocked in whispered parlours had become something sturdier, something irrefutable. "Do you regret it?" Elias asked softly as they wandered down a shaded path flanked by white roses. She glanced up at him. "The scandal?" "No. All of it. The way it began." Belle paused, then reached for his hand and interlaced her fingers with his. "If I had to live it all again to end up here, with you, I wouldn't change a thing." He stopped walking, his eyes fixed on hers. "There were so many days I believed I was unworthy of what you gave me, even your anger. It meant you still cared." "I never stopped," she whispered. He bent his head toward hers. "Loving you was the only honest thing I ever did." They remained there, forehead to forehead, as the sounds of laughter and music drifted behind them. The sun, now slipping into the horizon, painted the sky with strokes of lavender and rose gold. When they returned to the heart of the garden, the guests had gathered in a gentle circle around the gazebo. A hush fell as Belle and Elias stepped onto the platform together, hand in hand. They faced each other, not as they had 1 year ago, cloaked in obligation and wounded pride, but as two people who had survived the tempest and emerged stronger, stripped of pretense. Elias spoke first. "I married you because I was told to," he said, his voice steady but rich with feeling. "But I stand before you today because I choose to." Belle smiled, tears already welling. "I came into this marriage afraid," she said. "Afraid of you, of myself, of what I had lost. But in loving you, I found more than I ever thought possible." He reached into his pocket and drew out a simple gold band, thinner than the original but polished to a soft gleam. Belle extended her hand. When he slid the ring onto her finger, the guests burst into applause. She returned the gesture, her hands firm and sure, as she whispered her vow. "This time, I do." The music rose again, and as dusk fully gave way to night, the celebration began. No formal dances, no elaborate speeches, just joy, quiet and real. Later, as the last guest departed and the lanterns glowed like stars in the trees, Belle and Elias remained in the garden. The grass beneath their feet was cool and damp, and the trees whispered overhead. Belle sat on the garden bench, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. Elias knelt before her, brushing her fingertips with his lips. "I still don't understand how I deserved you," he murmured. "You didn't have to," she replied, tracing the line of his jaw. "You just had to stay." And he had. They kissed then, gently, reverently, beneath the soft hum of crickets and the flicker of fireflies, no longer strangers, no longer broken. They were, at last, what they had never dared hope to be, chosen, trusted, beloved. And as the stars emerged above them, one by one, the story of Belle and Elias Dunning found its quiet, triumphant end, not in tragedy or scandal, but in a love finally earned. 13 years later, the Dunning estate no longer bore the polished severity of its former years. Time had softened it, as it had softened many things. The sharp edges of scandal had dulled, the whispers long since faded. What remained was something more enduring than power or name, legacy born not of wealth but of love. It was late spring, and the countryside once again bloomed in hues of emerald and gold. Wild roses tangled along the garden trellises, and vines curled playfully up the stone walls. Children's laughter echoed across the fields, bright and unrestrained. Inside the house, Belle stood at the window of the drawing room, now converted into a library and music room. Her hair was still chestnut, though now threaded with silver. Her figure had changed, fuller at the hips, her posture more relaxed. But there was a stillness to her beauty that age only deepened. In her hands she held a letter written in a young, bold hand, her daughter's first from university. Catherine was 17 now, bright-eyed and brilliant, studying architecture at Radcliffe. Their son, James, 11, was outside with Elias, building a birdhouse beneath the old maple tree. Belle could see them from the window, father and son, hunched over wood and nails, arguing over measurements, laughing. 13 years ago, she had thought love was something fragile. Now she knew it was not love that was fragile. It was pride. It was fear. But love, when nurtured with truth, could bear far more than she had ever imagined. Elias still walked with a quiet intensity, though the weight of his father's shadow no longer followed him. After Alistair's death, Elias had dismantled the family's more corrupt dealings, sold their stake in the railways, and established a foundation to aid families ruined by industrial fraud, a quiet act of reparation. It had not made him beloved in the circles of old money, but it had made him respected. As for Belle, she had never returned to Fifth Avenue, not to stay. Her name was mentioned now in reformist salons, in suffragette circles, in the growing conversation about women's voices in America. She had published 2 books, memoirs disguised as fiction, and was often invited to speak to young women about dignity and choice. Still, she preferred the garden to a podium and the company of her family to any crowd. Not everyone had found redemption. Charles Merton, once a man of charm and pretense, had lost everything in the panic of 1907. Pride had driven him to gamble on risky ventures, and when the markets crashed, so did his reputation. Belle had sent him a letter offering help. He never replied. Her mother, Evelyn, now lived in a small house by the sea in Newport, far from the glittering society she had once worshipped. She had grown quiet with the years, gentler, humbler. Belle visited her often, and they spoke of Catherine and James, of recipes, of books, rarely of the past. That evening, as twilight spilled over the hills and the lanterns flickered to life on the veranda, Belle stepped outside and joined Elias on the bench beneath the wisteria. James had gone to bed, and the house had fallen into a warm hush. Elias reached for her hand without speaking. "I miss her," Belle whispered, thinking of Catherine. "She'll be back before the summer's out," Elias said with a quiet smile. "She has your mind, and your fire." They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the stars appear one by one, as they had on the night they'd first renewed their vows. The garden around them had changed. The world had changed. But in that moment, between the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of crickets, Belle felt something deeper than time. Something rooted in the choices they had made, in the pain they had survived, in the love they had chosen again and again. "What if we had never met?" Elias asked softly, his voice low. Belle leaned her head against his shoulder. "We would have survived, I suppose," she said. "But not like this." He kissed her temple, his lips lingering. This was worth everything, and it was. For theirs was not a love born of fairy tales or ease. It was earned in sorrow and in truth, in forgiveness and in quiet triumph. And as the night deepened and the stars stitched their silver threads across the sky, Belle closed her eyes and smiled. The world had taken much from them once, but it had also given them everything that mattered. Some stories are not born in fairy tales, but in the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be broken, and in the silent redemption of a man who dared to love without permission. Belle and Elias showed us that true love is not always immediate. It's not always easy or perfect. Sometimes it begins with duty, stumbles through pain, and is only shaped by courage, forgiveness, and choice. They taught us that healing takes time, that dignity is reclaimed step by step, and that it's never too late to rewrite your own ending. If you felt moved by their journey, by the tension, the tenderness, the fire beneath the silence, I invite you to leave the word gaslight in the comments. That way, I'll know you stayed with us until the very end, and that this story reached your heart. Please share this tale with someone who loves historical romance, with someone who believes in second chances, or simply with someone who needs to remember that love, real love, is earned. And if you're hungry for more stories like this one, with deep emotions, powerful heroines, and impossible choices, I've left a few waiting for you in the video cards above. Thank you for being here. Your presence matters more than you know. Until the next love story.